Okay, thank you all for joining this webinar. This is the Pollinator Steward webinar series, webinar number 1, Introduction to Pollinators. So I'll start here with a few minutes of introduction and then we'll get into the presentations. Okay, so the webinar series has been created by Pollinator Partnership Canada with Habitat Acquisition Trust, Saanich Native Plants, and Parks Canada. My name is Laura Mirandin. I'm the Acting Director of Pollinator Partnership Canada. Pollinator Partnership is the largest organization in the world dedicated exclusively to the protection of pollinators and their habitat. So my partners at Saanich Native Plants, at HAT, and at Parks Canada will now introduce themselves. Paige.
Hi, my name is Paige, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator at Habitat Acquisition Trust, and we are the local land trust for the Capital Region. And I focus on helping people understand and care for habitats across that focus area. And I'm excited to be here today, and I'm happy to field questions after the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Paige. Let's go to Amy.
Hi, my name is Amy Peltier, and I am a Species at Risk Engagement Officer with Parks Canada. Locally, Parks Canada has 2 protected areas, Fort Rod Hill and Bisgard Lighthouse National Historic Sites in Colwood, BC, and then Gulf Islands National Park Reserve in Sydney and the Gulf Islands. I work on habitat protection as well and engaging the public. And over the last decade or so have been really involved in Garry Oak ecosystem and coastal sand ecosystem restoration. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Amy. Let's go to Kristen from Saanich Native Plants.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Kristen Miskelly. I'm a biologist and co-owner of a plant nursery, a native plant nursery called Saanich Native Plants. And we focus on growing Indigenous plants to southern Vancouver Island and also native seeds. And we're really passionate about making those native plants and seeds available to folks like you and others who love nature and want to restore and enhance habitat. And in general, we just really hope that the work that we're doing is helping along pollinators and helping others help along pollinators.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, so a bit about the series. The series includes 10 webinars, and information on each of the webinars can be found on the Island Pollinator Initiative, that's the IPI website. We're sequentially conducting them over the summer and fall of 2020. Every 1 or 2 weeks we'll be having a webinar, and registration will open a few weeks prior to the date of the webinar. Recordings of the webinars will be made available on the IPI website after each one is completed. So we've designed the webinar series so that people can take them to become certified pollinator stewards if interested. Becoming a certified pollinator steward through the Pollinator Partnership Program shows that you have a science-based understanding of pollinators and pollinator conservation, and that you've taken action to help pollinators. So again, see the IPI website or the Pollinator Partnership Canada website for more information if that does interest you. I'll also be sending out some email information in July to all the webinar registrants with more info on this stewardship program. And I'd like to thank our webinar sponsors that have made it possible to provide this series free of charge. In addition to Pollinator Partnership Canada and Habitat Acquisition Trust, Whole Foods, Vancity, and the Growing Together Initiative have provided funds to support this series. Okay, so some webinar logistics. The presentation portion will run until about 2 p.m. and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers with the speakers and the partners. So you can submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function, but we won't get to them mostly until the end, until that Q&A period. So Paige is going to be our moderator for today. She'll be choosing the questions during the Q&A period. Also, another logistic thing, note that you can change how you view the webinar and the speaker layout throughout your webinar, through your webinar controls. So feel free to use the chat function to speak directly with Paige if you do have any technical problems. Okay, so I have asked you to submit questions throughout the presentation, and we're going to have a prize that's chosen by Paige, the moderator. The prize will be these new Pollinator Partnership blank greeting cards. So yeah, put your questions in, and Paige will choose one to receive this package of Pollinator cards. Okay, I'll introduce the two speakers for today's webinar. Myself, I'm Laura Mirandon, the Acting Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and the Research Director for Pollinator Partnership and Pollinator Partnership Canada. I've been a bee and beneficial insect researcher for over 20 years with a master's and a PhD and postdoctoral work at UC Berkeley. I have a number of peer-reviewed publications, have co-authored books, and have developed many technical and outreach guides on protecting pollinators. I work on national and international pollinator conservation and policy issues, and I've been with P2 for about 5 years now, and my ultimate goal is to create more sustainable landscapes that integrate conservation with human land use. And I'm very honored and feel really lucky to have Jennifer Heron participating in this webinar. Jenny is the Provincial Invertebrate Conservation Specialist with the British Columbia Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. She's worked with the provincial government for 19 years and directs and manages the provincial approach to invertebrate conservation. Her work includes the development and implementation of provincial legislation, policy, procedures, and standards for the conservation and recovery of invertebrate species at risk. She also works closely with the BC Conservation Data Centre on invertebrate status assessments, and today she'll be discussing the status of pollinators in BC. So here's the talk outline for today. I'll start with pollination and its importance and who the pollinators are, and then Jenny will discuss the status of pollinators in BC. I'll then follow up with some information and discussion about managed and native bees and their needs and how to support them. Okay, so just to get everyone on the same page, I want to start with what pollination is. Pollination is the movement of pollen from the male parts of a flower to the female parts of the flower within the same flower, between flowers on the same plant, or in between plants of the same species. Pollen transfer enables fertilization and the production of seeds. Pollination can occur a number of different ways, from gravity, wind, and water, but when an animal moves pollen, that animal is called a pollinator. And pollination is essential to natural ecosystems as we know them, with about 90% of flowering plants requiring or benefiting from pollinators for seed formation. Pollinators enable plant propagation, seed and fruit formation, which other wildlife relies on. So this means that they're keystone species in ecosystems. But in addition to natural ecosystems, pollinators also are essential to food production, with about 1/3 of our food being a direct result of pollinators. Production of pollinator-dependent crops also is estimated to have increased by about 300% in the last 50 years. And importantly, much of the nutrient-dense food in our diets are from plants that require or benefit from pollination. Okay. Now we're going to have a bit of fun here. You've all probably heard about the contest where you guess the number of jelly beans in the jar. Well, we're going to do a bit of a twist on that with a pollinator-dependent bean, a very important one in my life, which is the coffee bean. So what you need to do here is you need to guess the number of coffee beans in this 1-cup mason jar. Okay, so I'm holding it here. It's pretty much full right up to the top, and there's a picture of it there on the slides. And I did actually count every one of these. That's why it's a small container, a 1-cup container. So the prize for the closest guess is a mason bee house handmade for us by Wouter Clef of Victoria. Mason bee houses are a lot of fun. but they also take care and commitment. So please only participate in this if you'd like to win this mason bee house and you're willing to care for the babies. Unfortunately, many commercial mason bee houses aren't designed properly. This one is done in a proper way, and we'll be discussing mason bee and other native bee houses in more detail in the urban habitat webinar in this series. Okay, so how to participate in this. If you want a chance at winning the beautiful handmade mason bee house, you need to submit your guess in the chat function, okay? Because the chat's private. So please submit in the chat function to the panelists and do it in the form of beans equals and then your guess. Only one guess per registration, and your guesses will be, or the winner will be announced at 2 p.m. at the end of the presentation portion before the Q&A session starts. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about pollinators, but who are these pollinators? Pollinators can be any animal that moves pollen, but the most important pollinators in most ecosystems and in most agricultural settings are the bees. And when many people think about bees, they think of honeybees. Now, honeybees are not native to North America, and most are managed for crop pollination or honey or other hive products. They're essential to modern agriculture. But in addition to managed honeybees, there are over 20,000 species of native bees worldwide and over 4,000 species in North America. They come in a diverse array of sizes, shapes, and colors, as you can see on our 2011 poster showing some of the amazing diversity of bees. Okay, so what is a bee? Well, this seems easy, right? They're on the cereal box. But I want to get into a little bit more detail about what a bee really is. So we need to go back about 150 million years during the time of the dinosaurs when our forests looked like this. So one thing you'll notice here is that there are no flowering plants. Plants can't move, but they still need to have sex to produce seeds. So they did this mostly by spreading their pollen by wind. When plants spread their pollen by wind, the majority, about 99.99% of the pollen, doesn't land on its target, which is the female part of the same species. So when all plants were doing this, they had to produce an awful lot of wind-borne pollen to ensure pollination. At some point, around 140 or so million years ago, plant species that produced flowers evolved. They were designed to attract pollinators that would then spread their pollen in a targeted way from one flower to another. The pollinators got the food source that was advertised to them, and the flowering plants got animals to move the pollen in that targeted way. These flowering, pollinator-attracting plants could then produce much less pollen. Around that time, a solitary wasp that was feeding their offspring a carnivorous diet of mostly other insects switched to using only pollen to feed their offspring. When that happened, they became the first bees, feeding all of their life stages almost exclusively on pollen and nectar. And they were now the vegetarians of the Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, and wasp group. And also, when bees evolved, they developed specialized hairs and structures to carry pollen back to their nests. So this shows some of the incredible diversity that has evolved from bees. It has evolved in the bee group. You can see one of the largest bees here, the carpenter bee, with one of the smallest bees, the fairy bee, on its eye. And there's everything in between that as well, all different colors and sizes and shapes and hairiness. It's also important to know that bees evolved with flowers in a process called coevolution. So the bees and other pollinators you see in an area have evolved with those plants for thousands and thousands of years. This has resulted in all the wonderful diversity of bees and other pollinators and flowers that we have today, which rely on each other. In the second webinar in this series, we'll discuss this in a bit more detail and how it relates to selecting plants for pollinators. Okay, so let's get back to this. What is a bee then? Well, mainly what I want you to take away from this is they're not just honeybees. Also, they're not wasps. Rather, they evolved from wasps to be the vegetarians of the Hymenoptera world, which is the bees, the flies, and the wasps. So they're not interested in your food. They're not likely to sting you. We'll get back to that a little bit later in the presentation. They're great pollinators because they've evolved to use pollen and nectar for all life stages and have these specialized structures for carrying pollen. They're also very diverse. They tend to be docile, and they're critical to life on Earth as we know it. So who cares about all this detail? Well, I think it's important because once we start learning more about bees and other pollinators, we have a greater connection to the environment, and we're able to better understand the amazing relationships within it. When we start seeing the diversity of bees and other pollinators, we then care more, and we can use that knowledge to take action to conserve pollinators for food production, ecosystems, and for our planet. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jenny now to talk about the status of pollinators in BC.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, share my screen. Okay, there we go. Oops. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Laura. It's a pleasure to be given an opportunity to chat about diversity and conservation. And although the topic is conservation of all pollinators, I'm going to focus on BC's bees. And so I'll just briefly give. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I work a lot with Corey Sheffield, and him and I together have put together this presentation and given similar ones in the past, and so he is a collaborator and together. As well, I want to acknowledge all these funding sources and people that have helped over the past 10 years to really work on the bee diversity in British Columbia. And I haven't named people, but a lot of them work for these different organizations. And then of course, we also have independent people, especially Bonnie Zand and members of the conservation, the Garry Oak Ecosystems Recovery Team that have really helped to gather information on pollinators. So just a brief outline, I'm going to talk about bee diversity in the province and in Canada as a whole, and just a little bit about their taxonomic complexity and a bit on DNA barcoding and how this has helped to develop a species list. The diversity of bees in Canada's ecozones, a little bit on the conservation status ranking of species, and that's a very complex process, but hopefully I'll give enough of an overview so people understand how it links with bees, and then a few projects that I'm working on to help improve the conservation of pollinators in the province. So just a brief snapshot, I throw this slide up often. It gives an idea of how many different species there are in the province, and we really don't know. So there's 50 to 70,000 invertebrate species in BC, and no formal list has ever been compiled, but slowly these are coming together. There's about 40,000 insects. In 2015, Greg Pohl and a number of people pulled together a list of Lepidoptera in the province, and this is a big, long process. And since then, I think they've still added another couple hundred of them. You just keep adding to them. There's about 480 species of bees in the province. That number goes up and down because so many different people work on them and different theses are published and names change. So we're sitting at about 480 right now. For wasps, some groups are really well known and others no idea, and that's partly because the taxonomic complexity around that species group is challenging. And then we've got many different fly species and many different beetle species. I think there's about 100 families of beetles in the province, and not a lot of taxonomic knowledge around those for some of those groups. So Canada has 16 different terrestrial ecozones, and in order to look at how bees are grouped, what we did is record bees and just what ecozone they were in. So there's 16 terrestrial ecozones, and 6 of those occur in British Columbia. And that lends itself to why BC has such a diverse ecosystem, or sorry, diversity of insects and other species in the province. So when you just look at the bee diversity, the number of species is highest in the Western Interior Basin, the Prairie Ecozone, and the Mixedwood Plains ecozones of the country. And then Western Interior Basin is solely in British Columbia. So that really is the focus of a lot of the bees that are endemic to Canada. Sorry, not endemic globally, but they only occur in the Western Interior Basin in Canada. So when you look at bees across, this is another display of the different diversity or numbers of bees. So when you look at bee diversity in Canada's ecozones, you'll notice again the Western Interior Basin has the highest number of species when identified morphologically, but then also a few years ago there was a project to barcode all the bees in Canada, and the genetic sequences of bees came out to show more species. And so in British Columbia, again, when you just look at the genetic sequences and the morphology, it's the highest diversity in Canada. And there's real challenges around bee taxonomy and systematics. And so the different genetics of it basically showed that the taxonomy and systematics haven't been worked out. These species are different, even though they could look similar. So how many species are there of bees in the province? And in 2010, well, maybe 2008 to 2010, I really started in earnest to try and figure this out. Pollinators were emerging as a real conservation, a real need for conservation, and it was becoming obvious, or it became obvious that BC has the highest diversity of bees, and there were funding and there was interest in improving the knowledge. And so I was able to obtain some funding and collaborate with a number of people. And then eventually we produced a list in 2018 that compiled all the historical literature and new records that had been gathered over the last 10 or 12 years. So from that information, the next step is trying to figure out what the status are of these pollinators, of these bees. And in Canada, the two main methods for that are done at a national level through the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and then through a general status process, which is also led by the federal government, and when they produce wild species reports, and they use a different method called NatureServe methodology to assign conservation status ranks to all species in Canada. And the wild species reports or updates are done every 5 years, and the COSEWIC work is done once a species is assessed every 10 years. So to just briefly go over each of the two methods, COSEWIC is an independent advisory panel that advises the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Canada, on the status of species that are at risk in Canada. And this is, I won't go over the whole process, but they do use modified criteria developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they recommend species to be listed under the Act. So COSEWIC is the science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge advice to the minister, and the actual political decision to list a species is done by the minister underneath the Species at Risk Act. So it's two separate processes. And for bees, they fall underneath the Arthropod Specialist Subcommittee. And so to date, we've had seven bees assessed by COSEWIC, and 4 of those species occur in British Columbia. And so the ones highlighted in red are those species, and Bombus occidentalis, or western bumblebee, has 2 subspecies, and so that's why there's 2 different designations there. The southern subspecies is assessed as threatened, and the northern one is special concern. The Bombus terricola is special concern, and the next 2, Bombus bahivicus and sucklei, are both cuckoo bumblebees, which depend on, among other species, the 2 above them. The second way species are assessed is through NatureServe conservation ranks. And this methodology is slightly different than the IUCN criteria. And as I said before, these reports are produced by Environment Canada every 5 years. So the last information, there is currently ongoing work for the next version of this report for 2020, but using the bee conservation status ranks for 2015, Corey and I assigned the ranks for these species, and this is across Canada. So this diagram is meant to show that the different species that are at risk. So 43% of Canada's bees are unrankable, and that just means that there isn't enough information, museum specimens aren't databased, species aren't accurately identified, or we just don't know the taxonomy or systematics behind them. And species are ranked from NU, which is unrankable, up to N1, which is real species at risk. So the next slide actually is more on BC's bees. And so for BC, of the 480-ish species, about 17% are listed as N1 or N2, so they're nationally at risk. And that just means they're potentially, or they are endangered. The yellow, the green portion of the pie chart there, that means they're secure. So most bees in the province are assessed as secure. And then a large portion, again, we just don't know what their ranks are. The taxonomy is weird, they're known from one place, or just more inventory needs to be done. So I want to focus on the Western Interior Basin and talk a little bit about the species there. So it is the Canadian biodiversity hotspot for bees, but also for many species. So I think it can be said for plants and other species as well. About 411 bees are recorded from this small area, and 176 from nowhere else in Canada. So it really is unique. And it's mainly because it's an extension of the dry desert ecosystems of the south, and they just reach up into this small portion of British Columbia. So as I said, in 2008 to 10, I started working with a number of people to try and collect, identify, database, and georeference as many bees as possible in this region, and eventually, and this is ongoing, map these species and try to overlay that information with plant communities. It's really challenging to do species by species conservation when you know so little about these species groups, and to write individual status reports for 170 odd species of bees would be a real challenge. And so working to try and link them with plant communities at risk or plant species at risk, and then working to bundle those species into a conservation status report or something that protects the whole unit is much more efficient. So we started looking at linkages that can be created, and that's ongoing. And then as well, there's a number of threats to that region, and so working to address those threats is much more efficient than working on a species by species project. Finally, we are working on choosing long-term monitoring sites in the region so that over time, people can go back to those places, and long after I retire or others retire, these people can continue, or new people can continue to go back to those sites and create these, or have these long-term data sets to monitor changes over time. So there's been a lot of search effort for species in the Okanagan. This map hasn't been updated in a few years. I'm still compiling results from last year, but we have over 220 sites and thousands of specimens. And I just put in here that even though we've done all this looking in this area and outside this area too, we still have about 50 records of Western bumblebee, or Bombus occidentalis, and only one Bombus bohemicus, or gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. And so while gypsy cuckoo bumblebee historically may not have ranged throughout this area, there are historical records, and so we would have expected to get more in the past. But this just shows that these two species have declined substantially in this area. This is just a picture of some neat bees. Just over the past 10 years, we've recorded 30 new species to the province and 15 new to Canada. So that's exciting work. And it's through collaborations with other taxonomists that this information has become available. I I can't identify all these bees myself and rely on others to do that for me. And so it's great to work with these other people. I also just want to briefly talk about two species that have been assessed by COSEWIC as nationally at risk. The western bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee both have these extensive ranges in Canada. And one of the biggest challenges to assessing a wide-ranging species is that you need to have solid trend data in order to demonstrate a decline. And this is in order to meet criteria to put the species in a threatened or endangered or special concern category. And so Bombus occidentalis, the southern subspecies, was assessed as threatened, and that was based on historical museum data. However, species are assessed in 10-year timeframes. So from its assessment in 2015, looking forward to 2025, we need to collect data that can show a trend, whether it's increasing or declining. And so this is the challenge for the next while until the species is assessed again. And so a number of people have suggested that a citizen science volunteer bumblebee survey project or program would really benefit such a wide-ranging species. And Sid Cannings with the Canadian Wildlife Service has really started to lead this initiative. And so basically, again, we need trend data to assess all bumblebees, not just the ones that are currently at risk, but assess them all over time. And I've got in there western bumblebee. So in the Okanagan, I haven't recorded it much, but in the Kootenays, there's a lot more occurrences of the species. So what's going on in the Kootenays that's a little different from the Okanagan, and why are there more species? Why are there more records there? And having a monitoring project at sites where someone can go back each year and check those areas to help create trend data would be beneficial. So the idea is to do something similar to the breeding bird atlas or breeding bird surveys, where local citizens have bumblebee survey routes and can go back to these sites once or twice a year and do 10 sites along a route at least 5 kilometers apart, collecting as many bees as you can within a 10-minute time frame. And avoiding the time of year where queens are out, because you don't want to be collecting queens, and at the end of the year when the bees are dispersing again, so sometime in July or August. And then in 2019, I went along the crow's nest to try and find some sites in BC parks that could serve as these long-term monitoring sites. And so that the map is to just show these different sites. The other thing that long-term that I'm working on is a provincial pollinator conservation strategy. And this is just in its infancy, but again, it's a discussion paper and it's meant to engage as many individuals as possible in a kind of a paper or a strategy that will look forward for the next 10 years on how we as a group can work on conservation for pollinators. And it's not meant to be separate or independent, it's meant to be collaborative. And so again, this is something that I hope Laura and others will want to be involved in the next year or two to tie things together. My last slide is just a shout out to the Bees of Canada website. This is slowly being populated and it's led by Corey Sheffield at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. And it's meant to be a stopping place for people who are really keen on knowing more about bees and their distribution. And over time, I believe he may have already done this, but put live maps on here with records that can be updated and geo-referenced. And it would be tied with other data sets that are publicly available too. So check that out if you haven't already. And thanks for the opportunity to chat. So if you have, yeah, there you go, Laura.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was incredible and super fascinating. I will share my screen now. Okay, yeah, again, thanks so much, Jenny. That was great. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions too about that really fascinating topic. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some details about managed and native bees and how to help bees and other pollinators as well. But first, we're going to start with a poll here. So I'm going to launch a poll, and the question is, are honeybees in decline? So this is a multiple choice. Pick your answer, and I'll give people about 20 seconds to get some answers in there. Okay, we have about 75% of the people that have voted. Oh, we're still going up here. Okay, awesome. Everybody's into this and voting. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll here, and then I'm going to share it with everybody. And the top answer there is super interesting. 50 people voted from the webinar. The top answer is it's complicated. The second top answer is yes. Then the third one with 16% is no. And then the final one is I don't know. So that's great. So I'm going to talk a bit about this. But first, I'll start by saying that both those two categories, the no, honeybees are not in decline, but it's also complicated, are the correct answers here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about honeybees. Honeybees are not a conservation concern per se. They're managed by humans. They were brought over to North America in 1622, mostly for the production of honey, but now they've really expanded into crop pollination. And they are extremely important for large-scale agriculture. We simply don't have enough native bee habitat and native bees to pollinate these mass flowering crops that we have that are important for feeding our populations. So they are very important, but they are actually not in decline. However, and this is where the complicated part comes in, they are very hard to keep healthy, and I'll show you some of the loss stats on the next slide. But they're hard to keep healthy for a number of reasons. One, there's not enough forage. That's nectar and pollen for them in most of the landscapes that they're in. They've been really hit by pests and diseases. There's poor genetics in a lot of regions, and they're exposed to a lot of insecticides, and also climate change is emerging as an issue for honeybees. Okay, so here's a graph showing the annual winter loss of honeybees, and then the red line shows the number of honeybee colonies in Canada. Now, a certain amount of winter loss is expected every year. They're an agricultural organism, and around 15% is thought to be, the sort of normal amount of loss each year. So you can see that loss has been quite a bit higher than that in a number of years, this winter loss. But if you look at the red line, you can see that the number of colonies in Canada has actually increased since we started seeing really high winter losses in around the winter of 2006. So we're not losing colonies. Honeybees are not at all, they're probably the least at risk of extinction in the world of any bee species, but they are experiencing a lot of health problems and really high winter loss that might not be sustainable in the long term. But what beekeepers are able to do is they're able to split healthy colonies. They're able to import small colonies to start to then refresh their colonies of honeybees. Okay, so let's move into native bees, and Jenny covered a lot of this really well, so I will just give just a brief summary here. There's around 4,000 plus species in North America. They are essential for food production and for natural ecosystems, and they're great crop pollinators, so in a lot of cases they're better crop pollinators than honeybees. And we do know in some places that some species are in decline. And some of these reasons might look pretty familiar here. Loss of habitat, that's nesting sites and nectar and forage from plants. Also competition with managed bees. I'll bring that up a little bit later. They're being exposed to pests and diseases and also insecticides, and they're being impacted by climate change. So I usually like to have people keep managed bees separate in their mind from native bees. They really are two totally separate issues. But in terms of what's impacting bees, we can put pollinators together, all bees, those managed and native pollinators together. And the main factors that are impacting both types of bees are habitat loss, pesticide exposure, parasites and diseases, and climate change. And unfortunately, these stressors interact together so that in the presence of one of the stressors, bees are going to be more impacted by another one. For example, bees exposed to pesticides or bees lacking in abundant and diverse forage can be more susceptible to parasites and diseases. So how can we help bees then? Well, unfortunately, I think for a number of reasons, the message hasn't been translated correctly to the public. And a lot of well-meaning people that want to help bees get honeybees. And there are great reasons to get honeybees. You know, you want to produce your own honey, or you want to pollinate large areas of crops, or for other hive products like wax. But getting honeybees is not a conservation act. So it's somewhat like saying, to help save wildlife, I'm going to get sheep. And you can see that these two things don't mix. And I think that the media has played a role in this and not got the message all that straight. And in fact, there is evidence that managed honeybees can negatively impact native bee populations in some situations through competition for limited floral resources, by potentially changing the floral communities if they preferentially pollinate non-native and maybe invasive plants, and through pathogen spillover, which is the transfer of diseases from managed bees to native bees. Okay, so how do we help bees and other pollinators then? If we go back to this diagram on the issues both managed and native bees and other pollinators are facing, we can help by interrupting some of these factors. In particular, we all have the ability to create habitat for bees, whether a pot of plants, a pollinator garden, or if you're a land manager, maybe a couple acres of meadow. By creating these habitat areas that are free of pesticides, we can interrupt the synergy of negative stressors and significantly help pollinators. So unlike many conservation issues that are harder for individuals to tackle, pollinators can be a good news story in conservation, and we're all able to help by creation of pollinator habitat, whether large or small. Okay, so we're going to do another poll here. So poll number 2, I will pull up. And I'm going to launch this poll. The question is, if you make pollinator habitat, are you worried about bee stings to you or others? And I've launched that poll now. So it's yes, very worried, yes, a bit worried, or no, not worried at all. Okay, this is a super engaged audience. We've got 88% of people that have voted within under 20 seconds. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling here and then share the poll. Okay, so we have most people are no, not worried at all, and that's, you know, quite unusual, but I think we probably have a bit unusual or, you know, certain section of the population here on this webinar. We have some people that are, yes, a bit worried, and others that are very worried. And this is common. It's, you know, a legitimate concern. And I'll go into this a little bit as we talk about creating habitat for pollinators. Okay, so to go back to this issue of pollinator habitat and stings and what we need to be concerned about, or maybe not. I'm first going to start with honeybees because that's what most people are aware of, that are bees in our world. But honeybees aren't a good model for our native bees. And that's because honeybees are the weirdos of the bee world. I'm not against honeybees at all. I love honeybees. I love honey, but they are the weirdos. They are different. And that's why we manage them in these colonies for pollination and for honey. And they're weird for a number of different ways. They have these large perennial colonies. They live over the winter. That's why they're storing honey. They tend to be generalist foragers. They have a barbed stinger, which is kind of interesting. Other bees don't. They can fly long distances to rewarding patches of flowers. Whereas our bees in North America, most of them are solitary and they're ground nesters. They're not defending these large colonies because they're solitary. We do have some social bees here, mostly the bumblebees. And, if you poke your finger in their hole, they're probably going to sting you for good reason. But, they're not going to be stinging you. And also honeybees aren't going to be stinging you if you're away from their hives. Most of our North American bees are pretty short-lived, and they have a short flying season, and I'll talk about their life cycle a little bit after this. Some of them specialize on certain flowers. They don't store honey other than the bumblebees that have a little bit, and they tend to forage much closer to their nests than honeybees do. So when we talk about what bees need and how to help them and provide habitat, I want to just tell you a little bit about their life cycle, so you know what they're doing out there in the environment, and this gives you insight into what they might need. So we'll start there at number 4 with the adult. In the spring and early summer, adult female and males are going to emerge, whether it's from their tunnel nests or their ground nests. And what the males do at this point is they hang out on flowers or hang out around the nests. They drink and they mate. And that's pretty much all they do, and then they die. So they have a good short life, I guess. But then what the mated females do is they start making nests. And if that's in the ground, they dig into the ground. They will create chambers where they collect pollen and nectar, put down their pollen and nectar balls, and then lay their egg on it. This adult stage only lasts for a few weeks. So the adults are only flying for a few weeks. The reason that we're seeing bees all summer is because we're seeing different species coming out. Other than the social bees like the bumblebees, they're kind of an exception. So we don't see them flying a lot of the year. About 11 months of the year, they're in that top part of their stage, their life cycle, the number 1, the egg, the larva, and the pupa. So what habitat, if we're going to create habitat for bees, what do we need? Well, if we're thinking of managed and native bees, they all need floral elements. They all need some plants to provide nectar and pollen, and they also need places that are free of pesticides, particularly insecticides, because they are insects and they're negatively impacted by a number of insecticides. And additional habitat elements that native bees need are nest sites, and some also need native plants. And we'll get into more of that in the second webinar when we're talking about selecting plants for pollinators with Kristen Miskelly. Okay, so in terms of nesting sites, what do we need for bees? Well, about 70% or so of our bees are ground nesters. So they're looking for bare, scrubby ground, often well-packed ground. Schoolyards are often great for ground nesting bees. And so you can create this by maybe not mulching all of your garden, not worrying too much if your grass is a little bit sparse in places. You might see some native bees there. When I was working in California in agricultural areas, they were often along the paths that the tractors and trucks would go down, these really packed paths that seemed really disturbed, but there'd be a lot of bees nesting there. Okay, the next group are the above ground tunnel nesters, and this is about 25–30% of our bees nest in these tunnels, either man-made or natural, so things like stems and reeds, and the man-made blocks as well. And we'll talk a bit about man-made bee homes for orchard mason bees and other native bees in the urban habitat webinar in this series. Okay, so here's some natural-ish in my front yard, nesting for some tunnel nesting bees, and I saw some tiny carpenter bees coming out of these cuttings that I had left out. So, you know, one of the important things here is when we're creating habitat for bees, we want to be a little bit on the messy side. You know, we don't want to have these perfectly manicured gardens that don't have the resources that wildlife might need. And then, of course, we can put out some artificial nesting sites. This is one in my backyard that gets full every spring, but we do need to remember that if we are putting out artificial nest sites, we're starting to manage animals then, and we do need to then foster them and keep them clean. Okay, and then the third group are these cavity nesters. That's the bumblebees in our area, and bumblebees can nest in the ground in old rodent burrows. They can nest at the ground level if there's some thatch or compost piles, and sometimes some of the species prefer nesting above ground in tree hollows. And bumblebees, again, are a bit of an exception to most of our other native bees. They do live in these semi-social or fairly social colonies, and they do collect some honey. So you can see in that bottom picture, there's some shiny pots there. They collect honey for rainy, cold days. And some people do make artificial boxes for them with not quite as much success usually as the tunnel nesting homes that people make. Okay, so if we want to create habitat for bees, we want to help bees and other pollinators, how can we do this? Where do we do this? Well, we can do this in so many different areas. We can do it from a pot of plants. Roadsides are a great one. We're working a lot, more so now in Canada, but a lot in the US too, getting more pollinator habitat on roadsides. On the bottom left corner there, that shows some BC hydroland that we're working on with Saanich Native Plants and Peninsula Stream Society to put in pollinator habitat, and it's looking really beautiful. Corporate headquarters are great. Downtown urban gardens, boulevards, and up in the right-hand corner, you can see a school garden there. That's Reynolds with Heather Cooey. And then one thing I want to mention is that when we do create pollinator habitat, we're not just helping pollinators, we're helping a lot of ecosystem services that are important to people and the planet. When we put in pollinator habitat, we're helping with water filtration, erosion control, general biodiversity support, carbon sequestration. This is our Pollinator Partnership poster we do a poster each year, and this one you can find on our website. It's free to download, and it's interactive this year, which is pretty cool too. So you can find out more about each one of those pollinators and their associated plants. Okay, so resources for creating pollinator habitat. We have these eco-regional guides free for download on our website, and they have a lot of information in them about pollinators, and they also have plant lists at the back that are vetted by local experts for native plants that support pollinators. So you can find those on the Pollinator Partnership Canada website. And then our partners also have lots of local information and resources for creating pollinator habitat in this area here, Victoria, Vancouver Island. There's the Island Pollinator Initiative, which is a collaborative group, Habitat Acquisition Trust, of course, Saanich Native Plants, Life Cycles, the Ellie Lab at SFU, and there's others as well. Okay, so I want to end here the presentation by saying Happy Pollinator Week. This is Pollinator Week. It's the 13th year, I believe. So a great time to be starting this series and celebrating pollinators and just thinking about, you know, our connection to nature and how important pollinators are in our lives and to the environment. Okay, and in terms of the webinar series, I'll end here talking a little bit about that. We've opened up registration now, just this morning, I think, for the 4th. So the next 2, 3, and 4, the webinar registration is open. If you can't make it or if they're full, we will be putting up the recordings of each of the webinars. And these will run, like I said earlier, over the summer and into the fall. And you can find a lot of this information on the Island Pollinator Initiative website. The link, the address is there. And remember that there is the path to Pollinator Steward certification if you're interested. You can find information there, and you can contact me directly too if you're interested in that. Okay, and so we're going to go into your questions in a minute here, but your question might not be answered that you type in, or you might think of stuff later that you want to ask. Feel free to email us. You can email me. I'm there at the bottom, lm@pollinator.org, or you can email Jennifer Heron at jennifer.heron@gov.bc.ca. Okay, so now we're going to move into the question period, and I think Paige is going to start with the winner of the coffee bean count contest. And remember, at the end of the question and answer, Paige is going to choose and announce the Moderator's Choice Award, and the winner will receive that gift pack of greeting cards. And we'll get in touch with people after the webinar to figure out how to deliver or pick up the prizes. Okay, over to you, Paige.
Great. So we had lots of entries for the beans. So I'm going to ask Laura to privately send me how many beans.
I can maybe announce it publicly.
Oh, okay.
Right? Okay, there's 533 beans in here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
we had a fair number of entries. So let me do a little quick searcheroo. Oh, the 487 is pretty close. 487. I think 487 is our top count from Claudia Logan. Let me double check.
Yeah, it looks like less, doesn't it?
Yeah, perfect. So Claudia Logan, you're the big winner. So we'll follow up with you to make sure we have your contact information and we can get you your bee house, your mason bee house. And that's really exciting. And Laura, are you ready to go to some questions? Okay, great. So there are lots of really great questions. So I'm going to sort of start with, I'm wondering about if you have any tips for beginners looking to learn about how to identify native bees.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. And Jenny might want to discuss this one as well. So when we have people that aren't specialists, taxonomists, IDing bees, what we can do realistically, and which is really cool, is ID them to categories. So there are, I have on the website some bee ID into categories on the IPI website, which talks about things like the hairy-legged bees that carry pollen on their legs, the hairy belly bees, which carry pollen on their bellies, the bumblebees. So yeah, we can definitely, as lay people, people can ID bees to these broader groups, and it really does show you the diversity that's out there. You start seeing so many different things. So look on the IPI website. There's also an app for IDing bees to these course categories. It's called the Insight app. It was not developed by us, but we do manage it now. So you can search for the Insight Citizen Science app if you're interested in doing that. But yeah, it's a really fun world to get into, and starting to ID bees to categories is definitely possible for everybody. And one thing that I like, a little trick that I like when you're observing bees and they move, which is a pain, they move pretty fast, is you can get just a little plastic container, Tupperware container or something, and you can catch the bee on the flower. You can even put it in your fridge for 10 minutes and that'll slow it down so you can get a better look at it. It won't hurt it, and then you open it and let the bee go after it warms up. So yeah, start looking for those resources on the IPI website and start taking a closer look at them, and maybe look at the app.
Great, that's fantastic. Jennifer or others, feel free to pipe in if you had other suggestions in terms of identification or just looking at bees. We'll go to the next question that I can find here. Do all species of bees and wasps have similar venom for people with allergies, apart from their propensity to sting?
Okay, a couple parts there. Actually, I do just want to go back to the BID part. In this webinar series, we will be having one webinar just on pollinator ID. So I'm not sure which number that is in the series, but check that out if you're interested in BID. Okay, in terms of venom, no, they don't. There doesn't tend to be cross in the allergies and that anaphylactic systemic response to the venom in the stings. I'm allergic to yellow jackets. I've had the prick tests and everything, and I'm not allergic to bees or bald-faced hornets or any of the other ones. Propensity to sting. Some of the native bees can't even sting. They have such reduced stingers. Some of the minor bees, and most of them don't sting. Some of the social wasps will sting, so I think that's given a lot in the group a bad rap, because those social bees are going for similar food to what we like, sweet things and meat. But in general, yeah, I think the social wasps, although they're great pest control as well, they go after the flies in my backyard, they will have more of a propensity to sting than the vast majority of our native bees, or all our native bees.
So if you get stung by, if you are allergic to, say, wasp stings, and you get stung by a bumblebee, you may not have the same reaction?
You probably won't. Yeah, you probably won't. So in the labs I've worked in, people have developed allergies to bumblebees because we're going right into their bumblebee colonies and getting stung repeatedly and develop an allergy, or sometimes beekeepers, unfortunately, develop allergies to honeybees. But you know, from what I've heard and from what I understand, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean much for whether you'd be allergic to another species.
Nice, thanks. So this question is for Jennifer. How do you choose which sites to monitor bees long term? Are they known as diverse sites or protected sites, or are there rare species there?
That's a good question. So to date, it's really just been partly, a lot of my funding has come from the Habitat Stewardship Program, which is a federal funding program that promotes stewardship on private lands. And so we had a 4-year project to do outreach to farms and small natural habitats, and try and choose. Well, we approached lots of different people, but most of the people that wanted to be part of the project wanted to be stewards on their property for the long term. And so we would survey those areas, and then the biggest challenge is identifying everything you catch. So the bumblebees are pretty quick to get done, but everything else can take a long time. And so once that's sort of done, we've then either engaged the person, and sometimes landowners change. So I'm not really answering your question, but basically choosing properties that are not necessarily natural, but certainly have a lot of natural areas or wild areas on them. And then also long-term landowners. So parks are good places, but also private conservation lands or large farms that the owners are likely to have the farm for the next 20 to 30 years.
Great, thank you so much. One of the questions that came up was, how could regular folks and citizens encourage more bee research, or make kind of like encourage either the government to fund it or have citizen science projects here in Victoria area.
Well, I can partially answer that one too. I think the best approach is to work with non-government organizations, because they are often keen to do longer term work. And so someone like myself, I like, for example, these monitoring projects I want to get started, I'll work to get those started, but then I would love to hand the whole program or coordination of that program over to an NGO who could then I could then work with to help fund in the long term. There's always a capacity issue, at least in my job, and so but it seems, and maybe others can answer this better, that with an NGO you can make it like Pollinator Partnership. It's your whole program, it's your whole initiative, and you can do a better job at it. I think so. That would be my recommendation.
Great. Though we had a question about conflicting issues with pollinator conservation. For example, when you have land use planning decisions and Indigenous rights and access to land, with regard to who accesses the green space, you know, how could we ensure equity in planning for pollinator conservation in order to enhance the ecological resilience and the socio-ecological resilience? That's a loaded question. If anybody has ideas on what they're focusing on in terms of the impacts to biodiversity loss. Yeah, so I guess we're looking at trying to balance those two things, or those many things: pollinator conservation, ecological resilience, and socioeconomic resilience as well. Does anyone have ideas on that one?
I'll start on this one, and then I bet Amy might have some insight here as well. I'd love to hear. So in terms of balancing human land use with conservation, I think we can really do this in a much better way than we're doing at the moment. I think there's small changes that can be made in a lot of our land management and our land use areas to make the land more friendly for pollinators and to support biodiversity. So a lot of little management things like controlling invasives and allowing the natives to come back, reducing mowing on roadsides where that's an option. Things like that can really help us integrate conservation into our lives and into our land use. And then I'll turn it over to Amy.
Unmute myself here. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of encouraging work in this area. You know, I think pollinator conservation really overlaps with food security, and even in the urban environment here, we're seeing a lot more people get into backyard gardening, converting boulevards to gardens. It's something that you can even do sort of at the level of planting containers. If you live in an apartment building and you want to support pollinators, you can plant plants in containers. There's a really encouraging initiative happening locally right now called Growing Together, and also the Indigenous Foods Initiative, which is pairing people who want to grow plants, including Indigenous plants and traditional food plants, with resources to do that. So I think that's helping sort of address some of that inequity. So providing plants and soil and containers, etc. I know both those initiatives, at least the Indigenous Foods Initiative, is accepting donations as well for both sort of in-kind donations and financial donations as well to enable them to expand their program to more community members. So that is a really great initiative that people can support. I'm happy to send out the link to that as well if people are interested in checking that out. But yeah, I feel like, as Laura was saying, if we can sort of change the way that we manage our landscapes, even just within our urban habitats, there's so much potential to support pollinators in that way. And there's also lots of really underutilized areas in our urban settings and non-urban settings that we can look at and do some of this restoration work, like Saanich Native Plants has been doing with Pollinator Partnership and the Peninsula Stream Society, sort of taking underutilized land like near the George Tripp Power Station and creating meadows. And that's a really great way to engage local community members and also high schools and youth. So yeah, hopefully that partially answers the question.
Great. And one of the other webinars that we're going to have on this series is with Bianca Elliott, and it's going to be about Indigenous stewardship in the Saanich and Lekwungen territories, so you can look at that one coming up as well and learn a little bit more and maybe ask some more questions as we move forward there. So just getting back to some other questions, one of them is they collect insects, but they have reservations about collecting bees. Wondering if folks had thoughts or advice on that subject.
I can partially answer that one, and maybe Laura can too. I completely understand people don't want to collect insects, and I firmly believe that if you're going to take an insect or kill an insect, it needs to be identified and then deposited in a museum so that others can use that specimen for future research. And so I, for example, keep all specimens I collect and hoard them and eventually get them sent to museums or experts that can ID them and use the data. With that being said, there are a number of citizen science apps that have come around in the past few years. So I promote iNaturalist especially as one of those. And bumblebees are great. They're very photographic. And especially if you head out in the morning, you can often catch, or by catch I mean photograph, some solitary bees when they're resting in flowers where they've sort of slept overnight. And so I would encourage you to take photographs and post them to iNaturalist or send them to Bumblebee Watch. Or there's butterfly atlases. There's a number of resources, and simply using your phone or your camera is a very useful tool to help with conservation.
I'll just note there too that if you do have a function on your phone where you can record slow-mo, that's a really good way to record bees, because you can then take screenshots afterwards, but it really allows you to slow it down so you can see sort of those identification features.
What a great tip on the slow-mo videos. I love that. Yeah, so I get a lot of people sending me pictures, and sometimes you can ID things pretty well from pictures, especially if you get multiple angles. So I would discourage people from collecting actual specimens that aren't scientists and aren't doing it for a research project, but iNaturalist is great for helping to ID them and pictures and sending them to us. Jenny, do you want a bunch of pictures sent to you? But I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay with that, and I'll do the best I can. But it's yeah, we don't all need to be as citizens, I think, out there collecting bees. I don't think that's going to help anything, because they won't get ID'd to species probably anyways, because there are only, a few people around that are going to be able to take these collected bees and ID them to species, and you have to pin them properly and database them properly. So it's pretty complex. So I would encourage people just to try to look things up close, like Jenny said, when they're cool in the mornings, or put them in your fridge for a few minutes if you can catch them. But yeah, try not to do destructive sampling.
I also just want to add, if you carry a little spray bottle that you can buy at the dollar store or something and spray the bee with the fine mist, that will often slow them down too.
Okay, and sort of on that same vein, do we have time for a couple more questions or one last one? What do you think, Laura?
Yeah, let's go maybe one or two more, and then we'll.
Great. So this one has, it's a more local question. I think it's towards Jennifer. Any thoughts on doing bumblebee survey routes in other areas of the province, such as Vancouver Island?
Yes, the plan is to get these routes set up in as many places as possible over the next few years. And so my target this year is to engage 25 people across the province to do some, and then next year another 25. And so I have to start slow and have achievable goals, because ultimately any specimens that are collected will come to me and myself, or I have a field tech I work with too, Dawn. We process these specimens and ID them, and so I have to make sure I have the capacity to then process those going forward. So yes, absolutely, and my email is there, so if you are keen to be part of this program, email me and we can get you started this summer. Thank you.
Great, and we will have that other webinar on citizen science and monitoring and ID down the line, so feel free to tune in. And then one person was wondering about, they have a farm, but they're wondering in general about identifying native bee nest sites, and just in order to understand how they might be using the property, and also wondering about the flying season for native bees, when certain bees would be active in the season.
Okay, yeah. In terms of identifying native bee nest sites, again, in those eco-regional guides, it does talk about what type of habitat bees like for nesting. We have actual protocols that we've used in the research where you can assess them using penetrometers for the soil and, all kinds of things, counting the holes in the ground and stuff. I don't think that's what this person is interested in. But in terms of our ground nesting bees, if you start looking around, and I think you'll be surprised that you do see some holes in the ground with little turrets around them or beside them, a pile of dirt, and watch those. And I think just by observing things more, we can start seeing where bees are nesting on our land in particular. So areas that have a bit of bare soil or scrubby, the grass isn't like a golf course. Bees go in between those blades of grass. They go under ferns to nest, keeping things a little bit more messy in that pile of sticks over there. That's not just junk necessarily. You can leave that. So yeah, thinking a little bit more about what the wildlife needs and what these ground nesters need, the cavity nesters and the tunnel nesters need. And just keeping that in mind as you look around your property with a new eye.
Nice. So there is a question about managing honeybees and mason bees. This person sometimes hears too much human help, in quotes. Managing honeybees or mason bees doesn't let the bees develop genetic changes or resistance to resolve the issue on their own. For example, if you were to help mason bees by removing parasites, are you breeding weaker parasitic prone bees?
Yeah, and that's one of the issues that people think with honeybees. In some places in the US, there are feral colonies of honeybees that aren't getting hit by parasites and pests and diseases as hard as the managed bees are. But yeah, so there is that potential there for sure. And I think we need to keep in mind what we're doing when we do get into animal husbandry and we start raising animals. We're not doing it when we're putting out mason bee houses and other things. I don't see that, and I think most bee biologists would probably agree. I can't speak for everybody. I don't see that as a conservation action so much. I see that as an educational tool, putting out mason bee houses, and I also see it as an agricultural tool as well, because we can get more bees around our gardens that we want pollinated, whether they're large gardens or small gardens. but I don't think it's a conservation effort so much. And yeah, we need to be very aware that we're putting animals into an artificial setting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that, you know, they don't necessarily naturally nest in these little boxes that we provide, and they're very close together, whereas in natural nesting places, mason bees, they're not social creatures necessarily. They're a little bit
Aggregate, yeah, they're not
aggregate.
aggregating. Yeah.
So they may not in the wild nest in these very tight quarters where parasites can easily be transmitted amongst them. So I think that might be another thing to think about when we have these very large or larger than natural groupings of bees, like mason bees. Something to think about. Okay, so wrapping up, there's a question about pinning insects. Oh, I think we got to that one. And okay, so one of the last questions was, well, there's lots of questions still, but we only really have time for one. There's lots of questions about what kind of species people should plant, native plants. So just a reminder that we are going to have a whole new webinar right on, you know, plants for native bees. There's an interesting question about if there are any studies that look at nutrient density of pollen and nectar on these pollinator foods, and thinking about how we as humans think about nutrient dense foods and vegetables, and so wondering if the scientists here know anything about research that involves sort of the nutrient density of pollen and nectar.
I don't know much, so Laura, maybe you can answer that one.
Yeah, there is research. It's fairly limited, but there is research on the protein profile in different pollens, and the concentration of sugars and the different sugars in nectar. So there is some research on that. You know, we're kind of at the early stages of that, I think, but that's an important thing when we are selecting plants for pollinators, looking for the ones that they have evolved with the thought that they probably have evolved with these plants and they are the ones that are healthy for them. That brings up the idea as well of monoculture crops, and that's probably not the best thing for pollinators. They probably should, most of them anyways, be foraging on a diverse array of nectar and pollen for health. You know, it's like carrots are healthy for us, but we don't want to just eat carrots. And then sort of a final thought on that is with climate change, kind of an interesting talk I heard a few years ago about with more CO2 in our atmosphere and plants having less nutrition, specifically the pollen potentially having less nutrition in it because plants are growing faster, but not as with as dense a nutrient profile as they would with less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I found that interesting.
Amazing. Any final thoughts or input from the speakers on any particular topics that you want to make sure you mention before we wrap up here? Okay. Well, we are approaching our the end of the webinar, so I want to thank everyone so much. And if you
Paige, you need to pick the moderator's choice.
Yes, I'm going to do that right
Okay.
now. Thanks, Laura. No, that's amazing. So I think, you know, there's so many great questions, and I love them all. But I really loved the question we didn't necessarily speak about, but it was answered in this particular. I think it was answered by Amy. And oh, there's so many good questions, which is so amazing. So I'm going to pick Kyla Harriet's question about collecting bees to view an ID? How do you do it sort of in a way that won't harm the bees? And so I love that question. So that will be my pick for questions. So Kyla, we will get in touch with you about your prize. All right. Laura, anything else that I'm forgetting?
No, I think that's it. That's wonderful. Thank you all for being interested and being involved. And please reach out to us if you have any questions, and check out the next webinars in the series. They'll be led by different people in this group and other experts as well. And I want to thank Jenny for her wonderful contribution to this first webinar. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day and a great Pollinator week.